So Lauren, we heard about 2 tunnels and we heard about the billions. Is this a new idea?
It's not a new idea. What the governor proposed this week was a major new water infrastructure project for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, something not that far off from what he proposed 30 years ago, the last time he was governor. Since then, the water battles have been going in the Delta, and not a lot has changed. The reason for that is that the Delta is hugely important to California's water supply. Water from there goes hundreds of miles in the state. It goes to Southern California, it goes to Silicon Valley, and it goes to Central Valley farms. But what has happened in the last 10 years is there's been a major ecological crash in the Delta. There's endangered salmon, there's endangered smelt, and the crash has happened for a lot of reasons, but biologists point to these big pumps that are in the South Delta that export a lot of that water. They're extremely powerful. They actually reverse the flow of the river. So what's happened is there have been rules put in place to slow the pumping during certain times of year. That has not been a popular decision, obviously, with some farmers in the state. There's been lawsuits. So now the governor is proposing this new project. What it would be is a pair of 35-mile tunnels that go from north to south in the Delta. It would be taking water much further upstream, bypassing the ecosystem, and supporters are saying it would make the water supply more reliable and it would avoid some of these big ecological issues. But the governor did not announce a lot of details this week, so I think a lot of people are waiting to see what's going to happen. It's also very expensive.
Weren't those pumps the idea of his father? I mean, isn't that part of the whole bringing water north-south of his father?
Yes, and this is a huge legacy in the state of engineering, of plumbing, of kind of making the dry parts of the state wet with this water from Northern California going south. So it was really interesting. I think a lot of people at the Capitol were having deja vu 30 years ago and beyond.
The vast majority of this water we're talking about is for agriculture, not for residential or other commercial uses, right? So this is really about a big chunk of the California economy that's pushing very hard for a certain result, right?
And Brown said, you know, for a state as big as California with an economy, like, you know, people need reliable water, and certainly he has those interests in mind. But he's selling this as a plan to preserve that water reliability and fix the ecological problems. They're including thousands and thousands of acres of habitat restoration, which they say is going to help the fish.
Now, in the past, there's been a big south-north sort of debate. And now this seems to not necessarily be that geographic so much. Who are the sides here?
It's an interesting breakdown. Certainly the loudest opposition is coming from the Delta itself, the farmers. They're extremely concerned about the construction impact. They're extremely concerned about the water. The interesting split is environmental groups. There are certainly some that are automatically opposed to this, as they were 30 years ago. Others are waiting to see if actually the benefits will be greater than the harm for some of these species that are in trouble.
But there's a political split too, isn't there? Because our United States senators are both on board with this plan, but the Bay Area's congressional delegation is very dead set against it, right?
Yeah, and we're certainly going to see these kind of geographic overtones continue because it really depends where you are. If you're in the Central Valley, if you're in Southern California, it's much different than being Contra Costa County, Santa Clara areas in the Bay Area.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, though, during the old campaign about water, they used photos of people in Los Angeles watering their lawns while Northern Californians were drying out here below as a way of defeating this measure along the ways over the years. So what's the image this year? What are you saving or not saving? Is it the fish?
Yeah, a lot has changed. You know, certainly Southern California has put a lot of water conservation measures in place since 30 years ago. So that argument isn't quite as strong anymore, but you know, there's certainly going to be a lot of villains being cast in this debate. I think the really interesting part is going to be the ecological questions and whether all this habitat restoration can really help bring these species back.
Well, will voters have a chance at some point in this plan to vote on it?
So unlike 1982, Brown is saying not this time. He's extremely confident that this is going to go through, though. I think it's still maybe a little bit of a passion project for him. It didn't happen the first time. So there's certainly going to be a lot of political wrangling going on. The wildlife agencies that protect these species have to approve the plan. It's far from done.
Do we know, do the scientists know how to actually do the restoration?
It's a really interesting question because, you know, a lot of people might say, wait, we're already pumping water out of the Delta and we're going to be pumping water out of the Delta just somewhere else in the Delta. So how is that actually going to help the species? These are kind of big remaining questions. Certainly the pumps in the South Delta are very old technology, so people want to see that upgraded. But a lot of these questions are yet to be answered. It really depends on this productivity of this amazing estuary coming back. That's not an exact science, and they're embracing that uncertainty.
Well, how will this affect his efforts to get a tax measure across in November that he says we need to save money for schools?
So the majority of this project, at least as they're saying right now, the $14 billion to build these tunnels would actually come from the water users themselves. That's what they're saying. The other part of it, which is the habitat restoration, about $2 to $3 billion, would come from taxpayers or maybe federal sources as well. So he didn't seem too worried this week about it, but it's a lot of money.
Well, Josh, a lot of money is what they're worried about in the Parks Department. They just had a nice bundle dropped in their laps, but I guess they knew about it, or some people knew about it. And
it wasn't dropped in their laps. It turns out it was actually in their laps all the time. Basically, the state parks director had to resign last Friday. Her top deputy was fired after the Brown administration announced that there was $54 million that the State Parks Department had been keeping in two special fund accounts, even while the department had gone hat in hand out to the public and said, through the governor as well, that they were going to have to close a quarter of the state parks by July 1st if they didn't come up with $22 million. So now a lot of the communities and nonprofits and other agencies that sort of stepped up to help manage some of these parks that were threatened with closure are saying, we want our money back, because it turns out you had a bunch of money all the time. Now, here's the caveat. We're talking about special funds money here. It's not money that you could then move over and apply to the general fund budget deficit to solve problems in education or health and human services or stuff like that. The special funds are special, and they're earmarked for certain uses. The problem is it's really, really bad public relations for a state that's been struggling with budget problems for so many years to admit that it has money that it can't actually account for, even as the governor is going to the voters this fall asking for money to support education and K-12 education and community colleges and stuff.
You don't really mean they can't account for it.
Well, here's the problem, and it turns out that there may be a significantly bigger problem than just the state parks. We had a story in our newspapers today, I believe, by Mike Rosenberg with help from Steve Harmon and Tom Peel. It turns out that there are much bigger discrepancies in a whole bunch of those special funds in across all kinds of state agencies. We're talking about discrepancies of about $2.3 billion with a B. We're talking about at least 17 accounts that seem to have more reserve cash than what these departments reported to the finance department. And so the audit that everybody's already been calling for the state parks is probably going to have to get considerably widened. The finance department says, we're on it, we're checking this out, we didn't keep great track of these special funds, so sorry, but we're going to try to find out. But I think Mark DeSaulnier, the state senator from Concord, might have said it best. It's hard to ask people to increase their taxes when you hear about things like this. You know, it's just bad PR.
He didn't seem too worried about it this week. When he was asked about it, he said, it's a bigger problem when agencies don't have money. I'm not too worried about it when they have more money than they need. This can't be good for him politically, though.
No, it's not good for him politically. And again, I can't stress this enough. This would not solve the general fund budget crisis. Even if that $2.3 billion all turned out to be extra money that we have, which it won't. That figure will probably come out to be considerably smaller, because there could be just accounting bases that are different between these two ways of judging how much money we have. The actual amount is probably much smaller. That said, when you're scrimping and saving and cutting things like healthy families and doing all this stuff, you'd at least expect, I think most voters would at least expect, that the state would actually know how much money it has in all of these special funds.
So when will the hearings begin, when the legislature
When
gets
the
back?
legislature gets back, they'll
Yeah.
have to act first on this request for to audit the fiscal practices of the Parks and Recreation Department. I'm sure that's going to get expanded as the Finance Department gets deeper and deeper into all of these other special funds. Already you're seeing Republican legislators especially sending letters, issuing calls. They're saying that this has undermined the public's faith in government, that there's a need to restore some credibility to a damaged budget process here. It is not yet clear that this was the oft-mentioned and rarely found waste, fraud, and abuse. It may have been a bookkeeping snafu. We don't know all about that yet. But that said, whether it may not have been embezzled or stolen or anything, but if there's money there that nobody knew was there, that's a problem for somebody.
Gosh, two questions. What about the people that donated money to keep parks open? And what do we do to restore the park's reputation if it really turns out this is just a nomenclature problem? I call it one thing, you call it something else, or there's nothing that says I have to report
I think
this
it's telling that the
anywhere.
State Park Foundation, which is the entity that has worked most closely with state government to try to make sure these parks didn't close, they are at the forefront of calling for an audit here. They're outraged that they went through all of this, trying to line up donors and local municipalities and nonprofits and stuff to come up and help out with this, when in fact there was actually some money in the till, in some way, shape, or form in park special funds. I mean, you had a group that helped fund some South Bay parks, which said they sort of came to us under false pretenses. They cried wolf and we responded. That's becoming a prevailing feeling. I think it's the city of Whittier is out there saying, give us our money back. So you're going to hear a lot more of this over the next month for sure.
And maybe somewhere along the line, maybe it won't be quite as confusing as it's sounding today.
We're only a week into this. It's going to take some time to untie and unwind and unpack these books a little more.
Well, now who's going to oversee the investigation and the audit? Because it seems
the Finance Department is supposedly on it now, and hopefully we'll be getting some hard and fast state audit numbers later in this year.
But is that actually going to make people feel good that the state finance department is overseeing the audit of the state?
It'll be up to the state finance department to instill that sense of confidence. I can't say.
Well, Catherine, with your story, we are getting some bad news about how much the state of California is doing on behalf of its young children. There's no confusion there over secret funds or anything else. We just have a lack of effort.
There's something is missing, and I guess given the Olympics, I'll say that the gold in this report, which is the 2012 Kids Count report, it is put out annually by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the gold went to New Hampshire. Silver, Massachusetts, and Vermont got the bronze. And California wasn't in medal contention at all. We came in 41st overall. And now this looked at 4 broad areas. It's economic well-being, health, education, and an area that's called family and community. And out of those 4 categories, we actually did we did somewhat well in health. We came in around 23rd, I believe. There's so many numbers here. 23rd in health. And a lot of that actually was due to major gains in neonatal care in this state, as well as the Healthy Families Program, which we know is not going to exist anymore. They're going to move those kids into the state Medi-Cal program. And people I've spoken with said, we should be able to, we're working hard to make sure that we get those kids, but it could be that the data's out of date already. Then if we go from, I guess, the best to worst of the others, family and community, we were 42nd in the nation. And those are things like how many kids live within single-parent families and how many kids live with parents who don't even have a high school education. In California, it's more than 1 in 4 kids. In education, we're 43rd in the nation, and I guess that's no surprise. We just have not been doing, we've been near the bottom in education for years. The numbers, though, are more astounding than even I had realized. For instance, 3/4 of fourth grade students are not proficient in reading in California, and 3/4 of eighth grade students are not proficient in math. That's unbelievable. The report says, now there's some things about the data that they may need qualification. Like, for instance, they say 29% of high school students don't graduate on time, which means they could graduate after 5 or 6 years. In fact, California's four-year cohort graduation rate has been increasing slightly. So that's at almost around 23.5%, which is down from where it used to be. I mean, we're doing better than where we used to be.
So is there a gold medal? Is there any good news in this report?
There is not a gold medal here, no. There are some trends that are good, but there is no medal here.
Some of the economic indicators seem really particularly disturbing. I mean, the number of kids living below the poverty level, the number of kids whose parents don't have full-time year-round jobs, the number of kids whose households are spending more than 1/3 of their income on housing.
Right.
And what does that mean? I mean, what does that lead to? A child in poverty, what is that an indicator of further down the line?
It's actually, the interesting thing about these four is that they really are interlinked. And so a child who doesn't have good health care, who is living in extreme poverty and overcrowded conditions, who doesn't have enough to eat, whose parents really can't put, say, the time into reading to them every night, and the other one is preschool. And we have a terrible rate of kids who don't attend preschool. It's about 50% in this state. So when you're lacking all of that, you're really starting out at a massive disadvantage that is almost impossible to compensate for later on.
Catherine, in the last few seconds here, who's listening? I mean, where could something happen that could change the forecasts for the next report?
So kind of quickly, I asked these questions, and Patrick McCarthy, who's the president of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, said, he called it, quote, a persistent paralysis of our current political climate. Now, Ted Lempert from Children Now, which sort of participated in this, he said that the problem is that the political will in this state is disaggregated, that we need all these groups that are advocates for children for all of these issues to come together.
Well, that's a big command there. Thank you, Catherine.